Danny.
All right, we're going to put the bump stops in. These bump stops are beautiful. Much nicer than the rusty old crappy rotten ones. They go down here in this little hole. So the way to get these in, the old ones had a clip. This is the bump stop support bracket. We're going to stick it in the hole, lay the washer down first, center it, push the stud up, and drop the stud down, put the nut on it, and here's a neat little trick. Just spin the bump stop. There we go. So I'm going to put a wrench in here, and if you painted it, be very careful. Just keep rotating the bump stop until it bottoms up. Okay, now we're at a point where we're going to have to do it by hand. We are almost there. Very good. With the bump stops in, it's time for the upper control arms. Right here. Now these upper control arms are interchangeable, right and left side, which is a great design quality in my opinion. We're going to use our grade 8 control arm bolts. So the first thing we're going to do is try to slide it in place. Now we've already sized this, that's a little bit snug, and in some cases you're going to have to spread this out. So what I'm going to show you next is a little spreader tool that we made out of a fine thread bolt and a nut. So we're going to take this fine thread nut and bolt combination with a washer on it, and we're going to use it inside here where the control arm mounts. We're going to slide this in place and then spin it out. Goes right in line with the bolt holes where the bolt slides through. Now what we're going to do is grab a wrench, 2 wrenches, and we're going to expand that out because sometimes they crush in after the control arm has been mounted. So we expand that out, and you keep going until you feel the metal start to push, start to bend, and you have to go a little bit farther than that to actually get it to do something. Now we've already done this to this car, so I don't need to do it anymore. So when you're done, you take it out, loosen it up, and I'll tell you what, you can do this on the lower control arm, and then over here on the other side you can do it on the upper control arm. This makes life real easy putting this back together. So now we can put the control arm in. So we're going to slide this in place. If you do have to bump it in place, use a rubber mallet. In this case we spread it out enough where we shouldn't have any trouble. Now this tool right here we use to line it up. So now we're going to line up the control arm with this tool. That one's lined up. I'll move around. There we go. And if you need to line this side up, the reason why I use this tool is when the engine is installed and you're doing this in a car where you can't get a long lineup tool in here, this thing's great when there's lots of accessories in the way. Now I can do that and it goes in real nice. We're going to come over here and put a rag underneath this side of the control arm. That's the side towards the rear, just so we don't scratch up the paint. Okay, so now we're going to put the spring in. So let's come on over here to our suspension parts table and come in down close. We have to have a spring cradle. Now there's 2 parts to the spring cradle. This clocks the spring in the proper position right here. This just holds the spring. So when we put this in, the small coil end will go to the top, and the bottom of the coil will get clocked right here. If it's installed this way, that's incorrect. It has to be all the way over. So you have to figure out where the clocking is before you put this together. So let's walk over here. So I'm going to be clocked approximately in this position because, let's take the nuts off. Don't lose these, these are special locking nuts. Now with the cradle, we're going to be putting it in this position right here after the spring is installed. And then we will be putting the nuts on the underside. Get up underneath there. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. Everything's black, it's a little dark here. And they'll get zipped down with the air tool. And you can do it all by hand too. But it can rest like this, no problem, it's not going to fall out. So now how do we compress the spring to get it in place? We use this tool here. It's 2 pieces. This is the best tool to use on this car. In most applications, they have you put it inside the spring and it'll go upside down, or right side up, and then we're going to have it upside down in this car. This piece will go on top, this piece will slide down in, and then when we go over to the spring here, this will usually catch as much of the bottom of the spring as possible. It'll pull up and compress the spring like that. So, first step, we're gonna lay a beat up old dirty microfiber towel here to keep from scratching the paint. And when you put this top piece on, you want to make sure that you aren't putting it down on top of one of these studs. There we go, we're going to put it that way. Now, once I hold the spring in place, I'm going to drop this in through the shock absorber hole, slide this through here, and set it like that. But the rag will be underneath it. Before installing the coil spring, be sure to install the correct spring isolator at the top of the spring tower. On cars equipped with 1975 coil springs, use the original rubber isolator. On cars equipped with 1974 coil springs, use the urethane isolator. It will provide slightly more ride height. We're going to find the approximate clocking position. We're going to push this up into the rubber pad that's already installed, right about here. We have a rag in place. We have our spring compressor here. Drop it down through the shock hole. Put the rag underneath it, like so. Center it in the hole. Under here, this is hanging. If we need to drop it down a little farther, which we will, in this case, we unscrew it. Then we take the spring, make sure the clocking is correct. If you have the clocking off, you can recompress the spring. I'm going to use my leg to help me here. I'm going to get the next to last coil, unscrew it by hand at the top. There we go. You have to get that far enough to go underneath the spring. There we go, we got it. Now raise it back up by hand. Just kind of give it a little snug. Now if you notice this clocking is off down here, you have to rotate that to about right there. Because remember, on the spring perch, that has to fit right in there. So we still need to back that off a little bit. This is an estimation, but it has to land perfectly. If it doesn't, you can loosen it up and rotate the spring. So we're centered in the hole. Now we take my air ratchet and tighten it down. Watch the spring. have to go so far. And how do you know how far so far is? You see if you can put the spring cradle in place. You tip it in. And let's see, we're gonna have to go under the spring in the back. So we're not quite there. We are so close because that's almost, get right in there so you can see. That back part is still touching the spring. Now while you're compressing and decompressing, don't put your hands in there in case something happens. We're gonna run it up just a little bit more. A little more. There we go. Now we let it back down. Whoop. Want to keep your hands out of there as much as possible. And if you look way back in there, that spring's sitting in there very nicely now. So that's all we have to do. We're going to take it back out. The feet have relaxed. And now we just pull it up. You take everything out all at once. Now it does not hurt on this tool to put a little grease in between these anti-friction washers. A little wheel bearing grease and some motor oil or light machine oil in on the threads. If you don't, you're going to wear your tool out. This one's had quite a bit of use. Now at the springs in, we have to put the nuts on the bottom of the spring cradle and tighten them down. You have to be careful that you're at the right angle or it will slip and you'll damage the nuts. That's it right there. Tight. Give it a little hand tighten. Okay. There we go. That is in place properly. And the spring is in the cradle correctly. That's flat, that's flat. Now we're ready to mount the shock absorber and get the rest of the suspension put back together. Grade 8 suspension hardware is available at bighbricklin.com. Before removing the lower control arm, mark the position of the eccentric. Use a white line or a center punch if you're sandblasting and painting. To install the lower control arm, gently tap in place with a rubber mallet. Use the line-up tool to position the control arm where the bolt can be installed. The bolt head goes towards the front of the vehicle. The nut goes towards the rear of the car. Tighten the bolt temporarily until the alignment can be made to the vehicle. Now we're going to do the strut rod bushings and the strut rod, installing everything all at once. First of all, we're going to take the washer, put it on the end of the strut rod, the bushing with the little step towards the rear of the car, stick the spacer in, and that's all you need to get it in here initially. We're going to set it right here. Whoop. And then we're going to take a ratcheting tie-down strap, hook it to the front of the frame and hook it to the control arm. It's just an easy way to get everything in position. Don't need to be prying stuff with a crowbar or anything like that. Get it where the bolts line up down below there. We're almost there. Yep, one more. Maybe. Oh, and one more. There we go. It's going to put everything at a funny angle, but the bolts go right in. There we go. Got it. All right. Then you put the nuts on the bottom. You got to tighten them up right now. Don't do it later. Everything will be all cockeyed. Wrench on top. Now we can release the ratchet strap. You can put the other bushing on the back side, and the washer, and the nut. We're just going to leave it loose for right now. We'll tighten it up a little bit later. Now we're going to put the spindle support in. First thing I do is get the ball joint out a little bit. There's preload on it, so it's awful hard to move. Get it out, and make sure that when you put the cotter pins in, they go front to rear, not sideways or this way, because you'll never get them back out if you ever do any service work to the car. So make sure if it's not rotated in the right spot, rotate them. These were already pre-rotated. You can use a cotter pin puller and turn them around. Don't use the pliers, you'll mess up the threads. Because of the geometry of the strut rod bushing and the control arm, we actually have to push this control arm down. So I just recommend pushing it with your foot. And then pop it into place. There we go. Now, with nothing on here, let me turn it this way so you can see. Makes it real easy to put the nut on. To tighten this up without a spindle and a wheel on it, there's no way to counteract the force of your wrench. So we're just going to stick the line-up tool in here, rotate this around. And I have to make sure that when I tighten it, the cotter pin is front to rear once again. These get tightened down pretty snug. You're going to run it down probably close to 80 to 100 foot-pounds. When we get to where the hole lines up on the cotter pin, you have to, and your nut is just a little bit past it. You have to tighten it. You can't loosen it. You have to tighten it till you get to the next cotter pin location on the castle nut. This may take some elbow grease. Okay. There we go. Now it's lined up properly. We're going to install the cotter pin. This is the proper way to install the cotter pin. I'm going to do it facing us so you can see what's going on. Now, the proper way to do it, I like to use the diagonals. These things are great for this. Pull it towards you, flip the top one up, and then just tap it down. Now, the top of that should go more than halfway over the top of the stud. Now, the bottom one has to be tapped down, but if it touches the base, it can cause stuff to come loose or tear up the cotter pin. So you have to trim it and then tap it down, and that is the proper way to do a cotter pin. Go. We're going to do the top one now. I'm a little off once again on my cotter pin location. I have to turn it this way and then start tightening it. Slide my tool in, then I line up tool. I recommend using the box part of the wrench whenever possible. Yeah, we're touching there we go. Now, once you get it a little tightened, I can move it and show you what I'm doing. I actually used my foot there. Your leg is stronger than your arm. And we just lined up perfectly. One more cotter pin demonstration. There we go. Pull it around. We're going to do this real quick. Pull it around, push it up, trim a little off, wear your safety glasses, And if you have to, you can tap it like that. Gosh. There we go. And if you want to be perfect about it, just move it in position like that. Now we're going to tighten the strut rod nut at the rear of the strut rod. It's a 1-inch socket. So now we're going to put the shock in. And before we do anything, you're going to go to this little kit that you get with the shock. This is the front shock. We're going to put the 2 rubber bushings. They slide on here and they will stay on here. Then we can position the shock and put it in place. This has to be rotated so that these 2 studs are side to side on the car. The 2 top mounts have to be front to rear. Now, you can't just drop it in the hole. You can't get this to fit in here. It just isn't going to happen. So you have to put it in the shock mount, top mount bracket, and drop it down in there and try to get it to line up down here. Get it to line up in the holes. Raise the lower control arm about 1 inch with a floor jack to make the lower shock mount easier to install. Okay, we are there. We're there. Okay, now up here it will take, I like to put a washer on it because the original didn't have that, and the bolt kind of halfway sat in the shock mount. And these 2 extra ones here go inside the fender right here, and they do take a lock washer only. That's it. Some of these holes I've found don't quite line up right. You have to kind of wiggle things around to get them to work. Alright, you want to snug these 2 bolts down. Okay. Then you snug all 3 of these on top. Then you tighten these all the way down. Okay. Now I'd recommend hand tightening these when you get there. Right now we're snugging everything down except for those 2 inside the fender. On the bottom of the shock, lower shock mount, we're going to put the rubber insulator in on the lower half of the lower shock mount, the washer, and you have to hold it with your finger, and there's a lock washer, and last but not least, you have a little teeny nut. That's all that holds this in. Try and get that screwed down a little bit. Now there's one on the back side too. It's a little harder to get to. You got to kind of fiddle around to get that stuff in there. Are you ready? Okay. Push that in. I take my other finger and hold it up. Got to put the washer in. The lock washer. And the nut. And when you get it, it'll feel just right, and you can get the nut on. Now, to tighten them down, you pretty much need one of these. Now this is a 13 millimeter, but it's actually 1/2 inch. They're both interchangeable for the most part. Now we're going to put this up in here, tighten it down. Now you tighten it down till it stops. There we go. Don't over tighten it. It's just a small nut. It doesn't hurt to look at this while you're underneath the car. I've done enough of these where I can just stick the socket in behind there and know where it's going. There we go. Now we're going to put everything on the steering knuckle right here. This is the spindle. This is the brake caliper mounting bracket. And this is the steering arm. Now, these spindles will fit either side. On the right side, this notch for the bearing retaining washer will point forward. On the left side, it'll point rearward. There is a right and left for the caliper mounting bracket. And there is a right and left for the steering arm. Now, we're going to put the components together. First, we put the spindle into the dust shield for the disc brakes. Now, the steering arm on the back side goes across diagonally, so we put the longest bolts first. If you look here, you can see short and long bolts. So, when we mount this, and you got to remember, these holes aren't on a perfect square to keep you from doing something wrong. These holes are actually offset slightly, like they are on the flywheel of a car. Now, long bolt here for the steering arm. Oop, careful. Long bolt here for the steering arm, and here's a good picture of how it goes on the car. So now we have to put the brake caliper mounting bracket. Now the machine flat side is where the caliper mounts right here. The other side is rough cast. So you want to put the rough cast towards the steering knuckle, like so. And this should just barely be visible in the cutout area for the caliper to mount. Now, the steering arm goes behind the knuckle like this. So when we put all this together, we put the steering arm here and slide it together. Not too hard if you preload the bolts like that. Now we're going to put the short bolts in. Very nice. Now we're going to actually turn the wheel. Not only to get a better view, but to make it easier to torque all the bolts down. Now, if you notice, there is a washer towards the spindle side. On the inboard side, you have a flange nut, which basically has a washer built into it. The factory application is a lock washer underneath the flange nut. In this case, we're using a locking flange nut. This is fine thread, so use care getting them on. I'm going to use an air ratchet to speed this up, and here we go. Just do nothing more than snug it until all 4 bolts are tightened down. There we go. Now, the spec for these is 75 foot-pounds. And I've already preset my torque wrench for 75 foot-pounds. Oop. Gotta back it up with a wrench. $75 is a little bit of torque. There we go. Click it once, don't click it twice. After we tighten all 4 nuts, we can set this in the middle to make everything else easy to go on. After this, wheel bearings, bearing seal, steering linkage all gets hooked up. Now we're going to put the front eyelet in the spring mount. So you wiggle it back and forth, shake it up and down, and eventually you'll get to the hole. It's good. Put the bolt in, and you don't have to get the hammer to pop it in. It usually fits right in if you give it a little twist. There we go. Then we put the self-locking nuts on. Now we're going to put the rear shackle in place. And when you do this, you have to kind of jockey stuff around a little bit, and don't mind the white paper in the background. That's for illustration purposes only. And once you get it up in place, you can support it with a floor jack or a helper, or it's a good excuse to cancel your gym membership. There we go. Now I'm going to let it rest on those nuts. Now we're going to tighten the rear shackle mounting plate bolts. There are a multitude of ways to do this. You can actually put that on there first and assemble the bushings. You can assemble the bushings and put it on last. There's many different variations of this, but any of the ways will work. I hope this instructional video will be helpful in your Bricklin restoration project. For more information, go to bighbricklin.com. Steering linkage and stabilizer bar replacement will be covered in another video.